I stared down at my half-empty mahogany desk while 30 pairs of corporate eyes burned into the small of my back. The quiet atmosphere across the seventh-floor executive wing crackled with an uncomfortable, heavy tension as I mechanically lifted my personal belongings and placed them into a brown cardboard box. A small potted jade plant, 3 leather-bound analytical notebooks, and a silver-framed photograph of my late mother. As you may have noticed, Bennett has chosen to leave our team to pursue other opportunities, announced Brenda Holloway from Human Resources, her voice carrying an artificially bright tone that bounced off the polished glass partitions. It was his personal decision, which the executive leadership fully respects and supports during this period of transition. We wish him the best in his future endeavors. The corporate words hung in the air like quiet poison. A personal decision? I kept my facial features carefully composed and completely blank, even as my stomach twisted into tight knots. Exactly 20 minutes earlier, I had sat in my office staring at the official termination notice on my screen, complete with its damning internal directive printed at the very bottom. Remove him from the building before he talks about the Phase 3 trial results to anyone inside or outside the organization. What Brenda Holloway, executive management, and everyone else on that floor failed to realize was that I had already taken action. Before security arrived at my office door, I had quietly forwarded the entire unedited email chain to Eleanor Montgomery, our largest individual institutional shareholder whose brother had tragically passed away 3 years ago waiting for the exact type of targeted oncology treatment our company claimed to be perfecting. The very treatment whose clinical trial parameters I had discovered were systematically altered. Guard Otis, a broad-shouldered security officer, hovered uncomfortably close to my desk. His instructions from corporate security were explicit and inflexible. Permit no verbal contact with colleagues, provide an immediate personal escort off the premises, and complete total departure from the property within 30 minutes. My digital access identification badge already glowed with a solid red deactivation indicator light. May I at least say a brief word of farewell to my research staff? I asked quietly, keeping my tone calm and steady. I am sorry, Bennett. Protocol for voluntary separations requires immediate off-boarding without floor interaction, Guard Otis mumbled, looking down at his boots, unable to meet my gaze. Across the open floor plan, my lead analytical assistant, Clara Finch, stared at me in complete bewilderment. Only yesterday afternoon, Clara and I had spent 4 hours in the conference room preparing statistical models for the upcoming International Biotechnology Symposium. Now, mid-level executives whispered behind raised hands, their expressions a volatile mix of genuine shock, quiet pity, and in some corners, poorly disguised relief. Inside his corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, my department supervisor, Bradley Thornton, stood watching me while pressing his mobile phone tightly against his ear. When our eyes briefly locked through the window, Bradley turned his back sharply and closed the blinds. This was the same executive who had pulled me into his office 7 days earlier to deliver a stern warning. You are making a career-ending mistake by pushing this inquiry, Bennett. You need to drop it now. Bradley had been right about the career consequences, though not in the way his arrogant mindset had envisioned. I carefully placed the last item into the box, smoothing my hand over the glass of my mother's photograph. The bitter irony of the situation pressed heavily against my chest. My mother had succumbed to aggressive cellular carcinoma 5 years ago after enduring 3 separate experimental therapies, each marketed by pharmaceutical executives with glowing promises of breakthrough efficacy that ultimate data proved false. When I joined this firm as a senior biostatistician 4 years ago, at 48 years of age, I swore to myself that every statistical output bearing my signature would represent absolute, unvarnished truth. As Guard Otis guided me toward the central elevator bank, I caught a final glimpse of Brenda Holloway conferring in hushed, urgent tones with our chief medical officer. Their eyes darted in my direction, their faces hardening into sharp masks when they noticed me watching them. The polished chrome elevator doors slid shut, severing my connection to the professional world that had defined my daily existence for 4 long years. 30 minutes to erase 4 years of meticulous research, I murmured under my breath as the elevator descended toward the lobby. As my feet touched the polished marble of the ground floor, my personal cellular phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. A single notification flashed on the screen, an automated receipt confirming that Eleanor Montgomery had opened and downloaded the encrypted attachment containing the true clinical trial data. Now, the high-stakes waiting game began. Had I just destroyed my professional reputation and financial security for nothing, or was the corporate tide about to turn? Before I proceed with the details of how the executive conspiracy unraveled, I want to express my sincere appreciation for your time in listening to this account. If you appreciate detailed corporate whistleblowing, accounts, and workplace justice stories, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps these detailed real-life experiences reach an audience that values truth in business. If you have ever witnessed executive misconduct or stood up against corporate pressure, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Now let me explain exactly how I uncovered the fraud that cost me my job. My name is Bennett Vance. Until this morning, I served as lead senior biostatistician in the clinical research division at one of the country's fastest-growing biotechnology corporations. Our primary directive was developing targeted molecular therapies for aggressive cancers. That mission was deeply personal to me. My methodical approach to data analysis had earned me a reputation across the industry for uncompromising thoroughness. Annual executive performance evaluations routinely praised my statistical accuracy, though Bradley Thornton occasionally noted in my files that I possessed a stubborn insistence on double-checking verified baseline parameters. He once described my methodology as hyper-focused, implying that I spent too much time examining micro-level data discrepancies rather than supporting broader corporate milestones. The trouble had begun 2 months earlier during the comprehensive data reconciliation phase for our flagship oncology compound, designated internally as Compound VX-471. Early preliminary releases had yielded seemingly spectacular results across primary endpoints. The public press releases announced that 67% of Phase 3 trial participants demonstrated significant tumor regression within 10 weeks of administration. Upon that public announcement, our corporate stock price surged by 28% in single-day trading. Executive board members celebrated with substantial performance bonuses, and the atmosphere throughout the company was euphoric. As part of my standard operating procedure, I initiated a secondary quality assurance verification across all raw patient files. This was an additional layer of statistical scrutiny that I personally integrated into our department's workflow to guarantee data integrity before final submissions to regulatory authorities. While cross-referencing patient identification codes between interim monitoring reports and final analytical matrices, an anomaly caught my attention. Out of 280 enrolled clinical trial subjects across 12 medical research facilities, exactly 57 patient records had vanished from the final statistical analysis pool. Their baseline entries existed in the early monitoring stages, but their outcomes were completely omitted from the final efficacy calculations presented in the executive summary. I immediately scheduled a brief meeting with my immediate supervisor, Bradley Thornton, taking the comparative spreadsheets with me. I placed the documents on his desk and pointed to the missing entries. Bradley looked at the numbers casually before leaning back in his executive chair. Patients drop out of long-term oncology trials all the time, Bennett. Some experience disease progression and seek alternative therapies, others relocate, and some simply withdraw consent. It is standard clinical variance. I shook my head firmly. All 57 dropouts occurred within the exact same 2-week window, right before the primary endpoint evaluation, Bradley. Furthermore, every single one of these 57 patients belonged to the group showing zero tumor regression or severe adverse inflammatory reactions. If you reintegrate these 57 subjects back into the baseline cohort, the true efficacy rate drops from 67% down to 31%, which is barely superior to existing generic chemotherapies already on the market. Bradley's relaxed demeanor vanished instantly. He pulled the folder away from me and closed it with a heavy thud. Medical compliance and executive clinical leadership have already reviewed and authorized these datasets, Bennett. Your job is to process the approved analytical files provided by clinical operations, not to audit established medical exclusions. These are not abstract spreadsheet entries. Bradley, I insisted, keeping my voice quiet but firm. These are human beings participating in clinical trials under the belief that our data is honest. Desperate families are going to make treatment decisions based on these published percentages. Work with the approved data set, Bennett, Bradley commanded, his voice taking on an icy edge. That is an executive instruction. Unwilling to let the matter rest, I spent the following 3 nights conducting an independent, off-hours audit of the secure research database. Because of my senior administrative permissions across the statistical network, I was able to track the digital footprint of the data modifications. The logs revealed that the exclusion of those 57 patient files had not been performed by clinical trial investigators at the hospital sites. Instead, the raw data files had been altered internally right here at corporate headquarters. Even more disturbing was what I discovered on a shared network repository 2 days later. An internal server directory housing executive communications had been improperly configured following a routine system update, leaving folder permissions open across senior analytical staff. Intrigued, I accessed the archive and discovered a series of high-level email exchanges between Bradley Thornton, our Chief Medical Officer, and Chief Executive Officer Gerald Prescott. One message thread dated 6 weeks prior read, "Investor conference approaching in 30 days. Efficacy figures must remain above 60% to maintain market momentum and secure venture funding. Current Phase 3 projections looking mediocre. Options?" The response from Gerald Prescott was brief and unambiguous. Execute statistical refinement immediately. Remove anomalous non-responders from final cohort under protocol variance exceptions. Ensure efficacy matches market expectations. Proceed now. My pulse raced as I read the words repeatedly. This was not a minor technical misunderstanding or a difference in statistical interpretation. This was intentional. Calculated corporate fraud, executed at the highest executive levels to artificially inflate stock values, while misleading regulatory agencies and desperate cancer patients. I carefully saved time-stamped digital copies of the email threads, server access logs, and original raw patient matrices onto a secure encrypted storage device. Guided by corporate ethics guidelines, I determined to follow proper internal escalation procedures before taking external measures. I scheduled a formal appointment with Compliance Officer Evelyn Cross, presenting her with a comprehensive 40-page bound binder containing side-by-side data comparisons, server logs, and executive correspondence. Evelyn Cross spent an hour reviewing the documentation in total silence. When she finally looked up from the binder, her face was pale. "This is an extraordinarily serious matter, Bennett," she stated carefully. "If these allegations regarding intentional data manipulation are verified, it represents a catastrophic breach of corporate governance. I will personally deliver this dossier to Chief Executive Officer Gerald Prescott and Corporate Legal Counsel immediately." 48 hours later, I was summoned to a mandatory closed-door conference on the executive floor. Upon entering the room, I found myself facing an intimidating panel. Chief Executive Officer Gerald Prescott sat at the head of the table, flanked by Corporate Legal Counsel Attorney Audrey Palmer, Department Manager Bradley Thornton, and Compliance Officer Evelyn Cross. "Please sit down." Bennett, Chief Executive Officer Gerald Prescott began, offering a polished, practiced smile that failed to reach his sharp gray eyes. "Evelyn shared your analytical report with us. I want to assure you personally that patient safety and scientific rigor represent the core values of this institution." I felt a brief flicker of hope, believing for a moment that reason and ethics might prevail. However, Gerald Prescott continued, folding his hands deliberately on the table, "What you have categorized as deliberate data manipulation is actually a fundamental misinterpretation of complex clinical methodology. Our senior biostatistical consultants have thoroughly re-examined the cohort files and confirmed that the exclusion of those 57 subjects adhered strictly to standard industry variance protocols." I stared at him in disbelief. The senior biostatistical consultants had never been copied on any of the internal email threads I discovered. I opened my mouth to address the discrepancy, but Gerald Prescott raised his hand to silence me before I could speak. What is far more concerning to executive leadership, Gerald Prescott asserted, his tone hardening, is your unauthorized intrusion into confidential executive directories and your distorted interpretation of routine high-level business strategy discussions. Attorney Audrey Palmer leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished table. Regardless of how you access those internal files, Bennett, disseminating or misrepresenting internal corporate communications outside authorized channels constitutes a severe breach of your employment contract, your non-disclosure agreement, and federal trade secret protections. The executive message was crystal clear. Remain silent and compliant or face immediate professional destruction and financial ruin. We are talking about desperate cancer patients making life or death treatment decisions based on altered numbers, I said, looking Gerald Prescott directly in the eye. If our published efficacy rates are fabricated, we are selling false hope while delaying truly effective medical interventions. That is a defamatory and baseless accusation, Bennett, Gerald Prescott snapped, his calm facade cracking to reveal raw anger. An accusation that threatens to damage not only the financial stability of this enterprise, but the hopes of thousands of patients depending on compound VX-471. The meeting concluded with a stern directive. I was to cease all unauthorized auditing, restrict my work strictly to assigned routine tasks, and route all communications exclusively through Bradley Thornton. As I walked out of the room, Compliance Officer Evelyn Cross kept her eyes fixed firmly on her notepad, refusing to look in my direction. Over the next fortnight, my working conditions devolved into an increasingly hostile environment. My administrative privileges on the primary research servers were silently revoked, cutting me off from live clinical databases. I was systematically excluded from weekly departmental briefings without explanation. Colleagues with whom I had shared lunches for years suddenly became distant and evasive, clearly warned by management to avoid associating with a marked employee. Then came the final breaking point. On a Tuesday afternoon, an internal press release flashed across the corporate portal. Our formal application for accelerated FDA approval of compound VX-471 had been officially submitted, utilizing the manipulated 67% efficacy dataset. The company was moving forward to bring an unproven, altered therapy to market. That night in my quiet home office, I made the definitive choice. I compiled a comprehensive whistleblowing dossier. I assembled the original raw trial data, the altered final matrices, the executive email instructions ordering outlier removal, and a detailed 20-page timeline of my internal reporting efforts. I drafted a precise professional cover letter explaining the scientific discrepancies and their real-world impact. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I transmitted the entire encrypted package directly to Eleanor Montgomery, our largest individual shareholder and board member, whose public advocacy for medical transparency, following her brother's passing, was well known across the industry. The following morning, I arrived at the office early. Before I could even unpack my briefcase, an urgent, high-priority email notification landed in my inbox from Human Resources. Employment status terminated effective immediately due to gross misconduct and breach of corporate confidentiality agreements. Report to HR Representative Brenda Holloway. Security will supervise immediate removal from premises. Hinted at the very bottom of the internal notification was the forwarded executive directive from Gerald Prescott. Remove him before he talks about trial results to anyone else. Executive management had not anticipated that I would arrive 30 minutes before normal operating hours. Nor had they anticipated that before Guard Otis reached my door, I would forward that exact termination notice, complete with Gerald Prescott's damning removal instruction, directly to Eleanor Montgomery as addendum evidence. And so, 30 minutes later, I walked out of the corporate headquarters into the crisp morning air, carrying my cardboard box of possessions. I stood on the sidewalk watching commuters stream past, wondering if I had just irrevocably destroyed my career after 25 years in biostatistics. Would Eleanor Montgomery act on the evidence, Or would the executive machine crush my reputation under a mountain of corporate public relations spin? My phone vibrated in my hand. An incoming text message from an unregistered number appeared. Package received in full. Maintain absolute silence. Do not contact any corporate staff. Stand by for instructions. 3 agonizing days of total silence followed. 3 days of pacing through my apartment, jumping at every ring of my phone, mentally calculating how many months my personal savings would cover mortgage payments, and wondering if any biotechnology firm would ever hire a 48-year-old blacklisted statistician. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, financial news channels suddenly broke emergency coverage. Trading in our company's stock had been abruptly halted following a dramatic 28% plummet in value during midday trading. An emergency closed-door board of directors meeting had been convened. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. I answered immediately. "Bennett, this is Eleanor Montgomery." A refined, authoritative voice stated over the line. "I have spent the last 72 hours independently verifying every spreadsheet, server log, and email thread you sent me." My throat tightened. "And what did your team find?" "You were entirely correct, Bennett," Eleanor Montgomery replied solemnly. "The data manipulation is systemic and undeniable. The board has initiated an immediate forensic audit. Gerald Prescott has been placed on administrative suspension. Along with Bradley Thornton and the chief medical officer, relief surged through me, accompanied by an immediate wave of tactical concern. What happens to the trial and the regulatory submission? The FDA has been formally notified to suspend the approval review, Eleanor confirmed. But you must understand what lies ahead, Bennett. Gerald Prescott's executive allies still control the corporate communications department. They are launching an aggressive public relations campaign to discredit you before the full audit report reaches the public. She was entirely right. By that evening, prominent industry blogs and corporate news outlets began publishing coordinated articles. Biotechnology firm pauses regulatory review amid statistical disagreements raised by former employee. The corporate public relations machine worked relentlessly to frame the narrative. Subsequent official statements released by the company declared, "We maintain absolute commitment to scientific integrity. While we do not comment on individual personnel matters, we caution the public against misleading interpretations of complex biostatistical methodologies promoted by former staff lacking complete clinical context." The subtle implication was unmistakable. Bennett Vance was an overly rigid, disgruntled former employee who simply failed to comprehend high-level clinical trial adjustments. The personal toll of the executive smear campaign mounted swiftly. When I reached out to former academic colleagues and professional contacts for employment inquiries, my calls went unanswered. One executive recruiter was brutally candid during a brief phone call. "Nobody in the regional biotech sector will touch your resume right now, Bennett." The word circulating among hiring directors is that you are litigious and incapable of following executive chain of command. Even my former assistant, Clara Finch, called me late one night from a burner phone, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Bennett, everyone on the floor is terrified. HR interviewed all of us for 3 hours today. I found evidence that Bradley Thornton had me backdate clinical protocol amendments to make the dropouts look legal, but I cannot speak out. I have 2 young children and a heavy mortgage. They are monitoring all network activity." "I understand, Clara," I reassured her gentle tone. "Protect your family." 2 days later, a process server arrived at my front door to hand-deliver a formal cease-and-desist letter from attorney Audrey Palmer's legal department, threatening multi-million-dollar litigation for alleged violations of non-disclosure agreements. If I spoke to the press or industry regulators, the walls appeared to be closing in from every direction. The corporate apparatus was successfully stalling the internal audit while methodically destroying my professional standing. I met Eleanor Montgomery the following morning at her private family office in the financial district. Joining us was attorney Beatrice Wallace, a formidable corporate whistleblower attorney with decades of experience prosecuting executive fraud. "We have reviewed the timeline, Bennett," attorney Beatrice Wallace began, spreading detailed organizational charts across the table. Gerald Prescott's allies on the board are actively trying to soft-pedal the audit findings. They are attempting to frame the data modifications as minor procedural oversights that can be corrected with simple protocol amendments, allowing them to resume the FDA application. They are using the exact same executive manipulation tactics on the board, I noted bitterly. Precisely, Eleanor Montgomery agreed. But attorney Beatrice Wallace and I have uncovered something far larger while tracking Gerald Prescott's financial movements over the past 48 hours. Attorney Beatrice Wallace slid a thick, confidential financial file toward me. Take a look at these corporate registry documents and wire transfer records. I examined the records carefully. As I cross-referenced the dates of our internal clinical milestones against offshore banking transactions, a startling pattern emerged. Private meetings between Gerald Prescott and senior research executives from Solstice Biopharma, our primary market competitor, consistently preceded unexplained offshore transfers to shell corporations registered under Gerald Prescott's spouse's maiden name. This is not merely about inflating stock prices for an upcoming investor call, I realized aloud, my eyes scanning the transaction logs. Gerald Prescott has been selling our proprietary research blueprints. Solstice Biopharma announced their breakthrough cancer therapy 3 months ago, Eleanor Montgomery explained. Its molecular structure is 90% identical to our preliminary compound. Gerald Prescott was deliberately sabotaging our internal trial timelines and manipulating data to allow Solstice Biopharma to hit the market first in exchange for millions in offshore kickbacks. Can we prove this connection definitively to the board? I asked. We have the financial breadcrumbs, Attorney Beatrice Wallace replied. But to deliver a decisive blow at next Monday's emergency board session, we need an expert who can link specific scientific data leaks directly to Solstice Biopharma's patent filings. We need you to present the technical architecture. For 5 consecutive days, Eleanor Montgomery, Attorney Beatrice Wallace, and I worked 18 hours a day inside that private office. We constructed an unassailable evidentiary presentation linking the manipulated statistical datasets, Gerald Prescott's internal emails, the backdated protocol documents, and the offshore banking transactions. On Sunday night, hours before the crucial board meeting, Eleanor Montgomery looked at me thoughtfully. Are you ready to walk back into that building, Bennett? They will try to tear your credibility to pieces the moment you step through the door. I looked at the framed photograph of my mother resting on the desk beside my laptop. I have waited 4 years for this moment, Eleanor. I am ready. On Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I walked alongside Eleanor Montgomery and Attorney Beatrice Wallace through the gleaming glass entrance of corporate headquarters. Executive security guards at the turnstiles gasped in surprise when they recognized me, but seeing me accompanied by our largest board shareholder, they had no legal authority to deny entry. We rode the elevator directly to the executive boardroom on the top floor. As Eleanor Montgomery opened the heavy double doors, the room fell dead silent. 15 board members sat around the massive oval conference table. At the far end stood Gerald Prescott, looking immaculate in a tailored suit, surrounded by attorney Audrey Palmer and several defense attorneys. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Gerald Prescott demanded, his voice echoing with sharp authority. Bennett Vance is a terminated employee facing active legal action for confidentiality breaches. He has no standing in this executive session. Bennett Vance is here as my expert witness and formal advisor, Eleanor Montgomery announced calmly, walking to the head of the table. Before this board votes on Gerald Prescott's motion to dismiss the audit and resume the FDA application, I demand 30 minutes to present vital evidence regarding corporate governance. Gerald Prescott's jaw tightened as he glanced nervously around the room, assessing his board allies. This is highly irregular, corporate counsel attorney. Audrey Palmer interjected quickly. The agenda for today's session is strictly defined. I move to grant Eleanor Montgomery her requested 30 minutes, declared the senior board chairman, a respected retired federal judge. The motion was immediately seconded, and Gerald Prescott was forced to sit down, his face darkening. Eleanor Montgomery connected our presentation laptop to the main wall displays. Before I present the financial evidence, she announced, I would like to call our first witness. The boardroom door opened, and Clara Finch walked in, carrying a secure digital storage drive. Behind her walked Chief Statistician Dr. Alistair Thorne, the senior scientist whose authority management had cited to discredit my original findings. Gerald Prescott half rose from his chair, shock registered across his face. Dr. Alistair Thorne stepped forward to address the board directly. Members of the board, I can no longer remain silent while my professional reputation is used to cover up corporate misconduct. I was explicitly instructed by Gerald Prescott and Bradley Thornton to construct post hoc statistical justifications to validate the exclusion of those 57 trial subjects. When I expressed deep ethical reservations, I was threatened with immediate termination and career destruction. A quiet gasp rippled across the boardroom table. Clara Finch then plugged her drive into the display system, projecting side-by-side comparisons of the clinical protocol files onto the screen. On the left was the original protocol active during the trial. On the right was the altered document. I was instructed by Bradley Thornton 3 days after Bennett's termination to backdate this protocol revision. Clara Finch testified, her voice steady and clear. The revision was designed specifically to create a false legal justification for removing the 57 patients whose non-responsive outcomes threatened the 67% efficacy narrative. The board chairman leaned forward, his eyes burning with stern authority as he looked directly at Bradley Thornton. "Is this document backdated, Bradley?" Bradley Thornton opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked helplessly at Gerald Prescott, then slumped back into his seat without offering a defense. "Now let us examine the true motive behind this manipulation," Eleanor Montgomery declared, transitioning the screen to display the forensic financial charts we had prepared. For the next 20 minutes, I took control of the presentation. I guided the board through the technical data, step by step, demonstrating how trial parameters were deliberately altered to delay our company's filing while Solstice Biopharma finalized their competing patent. I then presented the corresponding bank logs showing millions of dollars flowing from offshore entities linked to Solstice Biopharma directly into accounts controlled by Gerald Prescott's immediate family. The evidence was overwhelming, precise, and completely irrefutable. When I concluded the technical presentation, absolute silence gripped the boardroom. The board chairman looked over at Gerald Prescott. "Do you or your legal counsel have any response to these findings?" Gerald Prescott's personal legal attorney whispered frantically into his ear for nearly a minute. Finally, the attorney stood up and addressed the board. "On the advice of legal counsel, Mr. Prescott declines to answer questions at this time. That speaks volumes," the board chairman stated gravely. He immediately called for a formal vote. "I move that Chief Executive Officer Gerald Prescott and Department Manager Bradley Thornton be terminated immediately for cause, that all executive severance packages be revoked, that full forensic dossiers be turned over to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice, and that our FDA application for compound VX-471 be officially withdrawn for comprehensive reevaluation." Every single board member raised their hand in unanimous support. "The motion carries unanimously," the chairman announced. "Security, please escort Gerald Prescott and Bradley Thornton from the building immediately." As 2 security officers led Gerald Prescott toward the door, his eyes locked onto mine. The arrogant composure he had maintained for years had completely vanished, replaced by the grim realization of imminent legal prosecution and total professional ruin. After the room cleared, the board chairman approached me, offering a firm handshake. "Bennett, on behalf of the entire board of directors, I offer our deepest apologies for the egregious treatment you suffered. Your courage and uncompromising ethics have saved this institution from total collapse." 3 weeks later, I walked back through the front doors of corporate headquarters, not as a blacklisted ex-employee, but as the newly appointed vice president of the Division of Research Integrity. The corporate restructuring had been swift and total. Gerald Prescott and Bradley Thornton were under federal indictment for corporate espionage, securities fraud, and wire fraud. The Corporate Public Relations Department had issued a full retraction, publicly restoring my reputation and praising my whistleblowing efforts. My new executive division had complete, independent oversight over all clinical trial data, reporting directly to the board of directors rather than corporate management. Joining my leadership team were Clara Finch, who was promoted to Chief Analytical Supervisor, and Dr. Alistair Thorne, who returned to lead data verification with renewed dedication to scientific honesty. Even Brenda Holloway from Human Resources visited my new office on my first morning. She stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching a folder. "Bennett," she began, looking thoroughly embarrassed. "I want to offer my sincere personal apology for the announcement I made on the floor 3 weeks ago. I was carrying out executive orders, but I should have questioned what was happening." I looked at Brenda Holloway for a moment, before offering a slight, reassuring nod. "We are establishing a culture of accountability here now, Brenda. Everyone gets the opportunity to do things right moving forward." Her relief was evident. "Thank you, Bennett. I will ensure HR fully supports your new division." After she departed, I placed my mother's silver-framed photograph in the center of my desk. The reanalysis of compound VX-471 was already underway under honest, transparent parameters. While it was not the universal miracle drug Gerald Prescott had falsely claimed, our true data revealed that it offered significant, life-extending benefits for a specific genetic subset comprising 30% of advanced oncology patients. Formulating an honest, targeted application to the FDA meant that real patients would receive accurate, safe medical care. I turned to my computer screen and opened a fresh document to draft the founding charter for the Division of Research Integrity. I typed the opening sentence: "Genuine scientific truth serves human life far better than profitable corporate fictions." If you have ever faced a difficult ethical dilemma in your workplace or wondered whether standing up for the truth is worth the personal cost, I hope my journey demonstrates that integrity ultimately prevails when backed by courage and evidence. The path of a whistleblower is rarely easy, but standing up for what is right is always worth the fight. Please share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. If this story of workplace justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more detailed accounts. Thank you for listening to my story.